Well, thank you all for coming. I really appreciate giving up your morning for this. It's really a great moment for all of us, and I'd like to thank Rael and his team for what they've done, and my son Travis, who's sitting at the back there. Travis has all the attributes of his mother, so it means all the weaknesses I have, my wife doesn't have, and so all the attributes I don't have, which my wife has, my son has, all of them plus my attributes. So it's a privilege to have him on board. This is a great moment. I honestly believe, and I've always teach students that you have to see the vision in the future, that there is a revolution occurring in the way we approach food, and the epicenter is Cape Town. It's not that it started in Cape Town, but something has happened in the last 6 months to a year where South Africans are embracing these new ideas in a way that no other country in the world, in my view, has embraced them. There are very strong movements about this eating behavior in Sweden, in Australia, New Zealand, and in North America. But I've not seen anywhere the same interest as there is in South Africa. And I'm reminded of it every day. 2 days ago, we were in Pretoria, and I was giving some talks to runners on nutrition and a few other things at a small school far in the north of Pretoria. And as we walked out after one lecture, I was next to Zola Budd, and 2 young girls came rushing up, and I presumed they wanted to speak to Zola Budd. But they said, "Prof, we must chat to you." So I said, "Well, who do you know? How do you know who I am?" So they both said, "No, we're on your diet." And this is a small school in Pretoria. Last night I got an email from a schoolgirl in La Rochelle High School. She's a standard 11. She said, "Professor Noakes, I have type 2 diabetes, and the food they give me is not acceptable for my disease." Now what she's done is she's gone against what the doctor is telling her, because the doctor is not telling her to eat this food. And she's gone against the school and said, "The school, you're not providing us with appropriate food." And that's astonishing in my mind. That's 2 examples. The third one is another humorous one. A friend went to Karlitsdorp, which you'll know is the kind of last town before Oudtshoorn. And he arrived for a coffee, and he looked at the menu, and he sort of disgustingly threw it down, you see. So the waiter came along and said, "So what do you want to eat?" So he says, "No, there's nothing on that menu for me." So the guy, the waiter said, "Oh, obviously on that bloody Noakes diet." And he followed it up with, "Half of Karlitsdorp is on this diet." So I meet everyone all day, many days, from all parts of South Africa, telling me that. Wherever I go, just 2 guys at the lift there said, "Doc, we had bacon and eggs for breakfast, thanks a lot." So why is this important? I'm going to show you now how we got our nutrition completely wrong. And I'm going to try to give you the evidence. And there is a crime against people. We just give them this wrong advice. And then we can't see the consequences of what we've done. And so people argue with me and they say, "But Dr. Noakes, you haven't got the final experiment. You haven't done an experiment of 50 years on this diet and see what the outcome is." Well, of course we don't. That's rather a difficult experiment. But every day I go outside and I see we've had a 40-year experiment in which we changed the diet, and the evidence is obvious. And to me it's obvious, if I saw a patient with heart disease, or diabetes or obesity, and they sat in front of me, and I said to them, "So tell me what you eat." Are they going to tell me they're eating eggs and bacon for breakfast, they're eating a high-fat diet? No. They're eating cereals and grains, they're eating all the other stuff they're told to eat. So isn't it logical? If the patient has got the disease and they're eating the diet which they've been told to eat, you can't tell us that it's our diet that's causing the problem. So I'm going to show you some really interesting stuff today. But the most interesting thing is that heart disease is a disease of the past. It's an epidemic that came and has almost disappeared. And we focus all of our dietary advice on preventing a disease that is in the past. And I'll show you that information. We should be eating for the whole body, not just to prevent our coronary arteries getting clogged up. But I'm going to show you today that there's absolutely no evidence that the advice we've been given, that a high-fat diet causes heart disease. There's absolutely no evidence for it. None at all. So let's go ahead. So where did we get it all wrong? We got it all wrong because in 1977 we told people that they must fear fat. And that developed this condition called lipophobia. And that is the single most important commercial driver of modern nutrition advice. It is driven by the grains industry, the edible oil industry in the United States of America drive lipophobia because fat intake in the diet in America has gone up since 1900. But it's not because people are eating saturated fat, it's because they're eating vegetable oils, which are the polyunsaturated omega-6 rich seeds from soy, cottonseed, and corn oil, which are highly toxic to the body, and that has increased. So the fat in lipophobia, we should be really concerned not about the saturated fat, because that I'll show you has gone down. It's the intake of vegetable oils. So if you're looking for a fat related to heart disease, you should look at vegetable oils, not at saturated fat, but we'll come back to that. But you have to understand that there are commercial drivers of this, and you have to follow the money. And I'm not going down that route today. I'm just going to give you the hard science today. So this is the model that we were taught, and this drives what the nutrition advice is. So I'm going to show you today there are two models of heart disease. The one is the cholesterol model, which is this one. The other is the insulin model. And depending on which model you teach at the medical schools or nutritional schools, that will determine what we advise people to eat. They're totally opposite. So we have to decide which is right. Is it the cholesterol theory, the fat theory, or is it the insulin theory? And you may never have heard the insulin theory of heart disease. And if you haven't, that indicates to you how one track the theories are. So the idea is that you eat saturated fat, that raises your cholesterol, that clogs your arteries, that causes all these terrible things, and the consequence you die. And there are 4 parts to that argument, 4 bits that you can test. You can test what happens if we put people on a high-fat diet. Does it raise their cholesterol? Or conversely, if we put them on a low-fat diet, what happens to their cholesterol? Does cholesterol clog your arteries? And then finally, does a clogged artery cause those things? That's the 4 components of the model. And they must all be true for it to be true. And the question is, has anyone ever investigated all 4? And the answer is yes, but they haven't put it together. So it begins with a shortcut. This evidence is provided in 1957, which I'm going to show you is not true. The evidence is that if you eat saturated fat, you develop these things. So in other words, people eating this are shown to have that. And they don't go through the mechanisms. They just say, well, that causes that, so therefore this is how it happens. But that's not how you do science. Science, you must dissect out each component and see that they're all true. So let's go ahead. So this begins with Ansel Keys, who in 1953 decides by himself that heart disease is caused by fat in the diet. He makes that decision, and he decides to prove it. Now, science is not about proving, it's about disproving. And he goes and looks for some data that will prove his theory. And he finds evidence that countries that have more fat in the diet have higher rates of heart disease. So he says, there you are. And he publishes this figure and starts the campaign based on this evidence. What he does is he ignores any country which has a high rate of fat intake and a low rate of heart disease. For example, France, Switzerland, and some of the other European countries which fit down there. He ignored them because he knew that they conflicted with his theory, so he just tossed them out. He never bothered to experiment in the countries where he was known his theory didn't support it, wasn't supported. So he then went, and this was the published paper, and then he went and published, in the 1970s, he did the famous 7-country study. He chose the 7 countries where he had some with low heart disease and low fat, and some with high fat intakes and high heart disease. And he ignored the ones here, and he ignored the ones there. So he chose selectively the countries that would give him the answer he wanted. And the point here is that this association never proves causation. You can't say because this and that are associated, they're causally related. And we teach when we teach students, we say that this is naive. The naivety of such an interpretation of associated attributes is now a classroom demonstration. So, and most of what you read about nutrition in the Cape Times or the Cape Argus is associational studies, which prove nothing. They absolutely prove nothing. You have to ask, was this study a prospective study where we changed something, or was it just looking at associations? So along came other people and they said, hold it, you cut out a whole bunch of data. What about France? Why didn't you include France, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? And when you include all these countries, it doesn't look so great. And for example, if you compare Finland and Mexico, they have the same intake of fat in the diet, but totally different rates of heart disease. So the model doesn't work for all countries. And people then came along, the scientists, and I'm not going to read it all, we don't have time, and they said that the relationship between fat in the diet and heart disease is not valid. It's specific neither for dietary fat nor for heart disease. Clearly, this tenuous association cannot serve as much support for the hypothesis, which implicates fat as an etiological factor in heart disease. And this is 1957. So these are the experts, epidemiology experts, who say, Keys, you got it wrong. You can't claim that association. And even the American Heart Association met in 1957, and they said his hypothesis was not credible because it was associational. But 4 years later, the American Heart Association came and said, no, we support his theory. Now, how can they do that? Because there were no new data at all, no new data. And the answer was Keys was appointed to the main committee, and he changed. He was a very persuasive speaker, and he manipulated and changed opinions. And so all of a sudden, in 1961, heart disease is caused by fat in the diet, without any evidence. Please understand, that associational study proves nothing. And if you were to repeat that study today and go and look at European countries, this is what you find. The more fat in the diet, more saturated fat, the lower the rates of heart disease. The less fat in the diet, the higher the rates. Now, if we were Keys, we would have to say, you see, saturated fat prevents heart disease. I'm not saying that. It may well be that there are associations. These people could be wealthier countries. They could be more physically active. They might smoke less. There could be 1,000 reasons. And these people could be eating more sugar and more vegetable oils. You can't say it's saturated fat. It could be anything. But the point is, it doesn't fit the model anymore. And just to remind you, the 3 healthiest countries in the world, Holland, Switzerland, and France, sit down here, and they do not restrict their fat intake. Why not? Because they don't speak English. And they didn't follow the stupid American guidelines. Yeah. So remember that. Okay. So just to jump forward, now Harvard finally wakes up. The Harvard School of Public Health last year writes this. They said, well, it's time to end the low-fat myth. So now it's not Tim Noakes speaking, it's Harvard Medical School. And these have studied this problem for years. And they've not always said this. They've had other statements in the past. They definitely supported the original guidelines of the food guide in 1977. The low-fat approach to eating may have made a difference for the occasional individual. And I admit, there may be an occasional individual who will benefit from this diet, the occasional individual, but as a group, it hasn't helped the nation control their weight or become healthier. They simply become fatter. So the point is that this has never been proven. And so we can't just assume that because that is linked to that in Keys's original falsified information, that we can accept the whole model. We now have to go and look at the total model. So all of you know, I mean, obviously, if you eat fat, your cholesterol is going to go up. I mean, that's obvious. You know that. It's taught everywhere. Well, let's look at the evidence. So these are data from Jeff Volek, who's he deserves the Nobel Prize for studies of low-carbohydrate, high-fat diets. He's the world authority on this. He's spent the last 20 years studying it. And you can imagine that there's been massive criticism, and he's struggled to find the funding because there's such resistance to what he found. Here he takes a group of people with insulin resistance, and this is the topic we're going to discuss, or the metabolic syndrome. And he puts some on a high-carbohydrate, low-fat diet. That's the diet that's supposedly healthy, the prudent diet. And he puts another group on the low-carbohydrate, high-fat diet, 60% fat. I mean, these people are going to drop dead the next day, obviously, because they're eating a high-fat diet. And this is the evidence that I wasn't allowed to present in the debate with Professor Opie, because he said there's no evidence. Well, you see, the problem is this: he can't publish this in the New England Journal of Medicine because there's bias in selection of what they'll publish. So it published in a different journal, which perhaps not everyone reads. So now, after 6 months on this trial, the body mass loss is greater on the yellow group. So the yellow is the low carbohydrate group. Abdominal fat goes down more on the one group. Blood glucose, which we'll show you is a big predictor of risk, goes down. So this is fasting blood glucose. But as I'm going to talk mainly about insulin, because insulin, as I'll show you, is the driver of heart disease. Insulin shoots down by 50%. So when you eat a high-fat diet, you reduce your circulating insulin dramatically, and that has huge effects, as I'll show you. And I'm not going to discuss those two. Now, the other variable which I'm going to discuss is the blood triglyceride concentrations, and they go down hugely. And you have to know what your triglycerides are, because if they're elevated, I'll show you you've got insulin resistance and you're eating too much carbohydrate. But you'll never be told that, because there's no drug that will reduce triglycerides. So we, as doctors, we ignore it. It's just not important, but it's crucially important, as I'll show you. And this is, don't worry about that. Now, this is, all of you know the so-called HDL cholesterol is the good cholesterol, which is garbage. Anyone who tells you that's an idiot. So if someone talks to you about good and bad cholesterol, they're idiots, and just remember that. So, okay. So the idiot statement is that this is the good cholesterol. Well, guess what? It's gone up, so that's great. And what happens if you go on a high carbohydrate, it actually goes down. So if we put people with cholesterol problems on a low fat diet, their good cholesterol goes down. How can that be good? No one ever tells you that. And then the ratio, which we think is a very good predictor of heart disease, is incredibly improved on the high fat diet. Now I'm going to introduce you to the really bad cholesterol, or the small, dense LDL cholesterol particles. They're the ones that are really damaging to your health. And now we want to see them go down. And guess what? When you eat a high-fat diet, they go down. Whereas on a high-carbohydrate diet, they go up. So if you've been told to go on a high-carbohydrate diet, your HDL cholesterol will go down and your bad particles will go up. And you're never told that. Why? Because your total cholesterol may come down, and the doctors focus only on the total cholesterol. And so they say, therefore, gee, you're doing better. But they don't measure these things, and they don't understand them. So they're giving you the exactly wrong advice. It's astonishing. Yeah, and with respect, Lionel made a major error in the debate, not after the debate. If you watch the carte blanche interview, he said that small LDL particles, he said they go up on a high-fat diet. It's wrong. They go down on a high-fat diet, and they go up on a high-carbohydrate diet. So he got it completely wrong. Okay, and then this is really interesting. The saturated fat in your blood goes down when you eat a saturated fat more in the diet. Why? Because you cut the carbohydrates out, and it's the carbohydrates that are driving from it. Now, ApoB is another big predictor, because ApoB predicts also indirectly your LDL-C particles. And you can see that it's gone down substantially on this high-fat diet. And then and so the ratio, whichever it is, that improves. So, tell me, in all conscience, would you rather be eating the high-carbohydrate diet or the low-carbohydrate diet? It's obvious. The yellow is completely dominating. And the biology is very clear why, if you have this metabolic syndrome, why you should be on a high-fat diet. And why the evidence you've been given that you must eat a low-fat diet is completely wrong. And then we have analyses which are done on many, many studies where they look at exactly what happens to your total cholesterol, because that's what the doctors are looking at. And it is true in some people the cholesterol does go up quite substantially on this diet, but on average, when you look at everyone, this is what happens. This is low density, this is so-called bad cholesterol, did not change significantly. And this is an analysis of tens of thousands of people. So the idea that your cholesterol will definitely rise on a high-fat diet is wrong. But now let's take the converse. Let's say you have high cholesterol and you go on a low-fat diet, i.e. high-carbohydrate diet. How much does your cholesterol drop? It drops marginally, about 0.2 millimoles per liter, which is nothing. It's biologically irrelevant. So even if you believe that you must lower your cholesterol and you go on this diet, the effect is so small as to be, and it doesn't really help you. Okay, so that's the problem. So that's wrong. That's not true. But this is the real one. Because all of you know, we know, that your cholesterol in your blood predicts how bad your arteries are. I mean, that's the basis for the theory. The more your cholesterol, the higher more the clogged arteries must be. Well, let's look at that. So this is the first experiment that was done in 1936. Sorry, 1936, yeah. This guy, very cleverly, went to the autopsy room, and he took the hearts outside the aortas, which is the big artery at the back of the body, and he measured how much fat was present there, and he knew what the cholesterol concentration in the blood was of these people. Now, what you'd expect is a linear increase like this, so that the more cholesterol in the blood, the worse the artery damage. And there is no relationship whatsoever. And that has been known in 1936. So you could go to the doctor. Now, 200, if you go to the doctor and your value is 190, he'll say, fantastic, you're going to live forever. Trouble is, 50% of people who have heart disease have cholesterols below normal, the normal or below, as I'll show you in due course. Okay? So having a normal cholesterol means absolutely nothing, because you could have severe disease. This guy's about to die, and he's got a normal cholesterol. And this guy over here is never going to die, and his value is over 9. His value is 9. So it's completely meaningless. Now, of course, this is a 1936 study, so what do we do? So anyway, then there are other studies, and this is an analysis of all the studies, and I'm just going to go through briefly. It says the large number of null results, now, i.e. there was not a relationship, for the association between bad cholesterol and the prevalence or progression of both calcified and non-calcified plaque, that's the arterial damage, in the different vascular beds over a wide range of ages, etc., cannot be easily dismissed. What he's saying is there's no evidence for the theory, that there isn't. They haven't found evidence that the theory fits. And then another analysis done by another guy who's been battling for a long time, he begins with a statement made by 2 Nobel Prize winners. They say the more bad cholesterol there is in the blood, the more rapidly arterial disease develops. And they won the Nobel Prize for promoting that theory. Okay? And he says this statement appears to be falsified. And science is all about falsification, remember, by the fact that the degree of atherosclerosis, etc., were independent of the concentration or change in the bad cholesterol in almost all studies. And he says the role of LDL cholesterol has been exaggerated. So that's what the independent analysis suggests of all the studies that have been done. There's no linkage ever been found between cholesterol in the blood and the disease of your arteries. But it gets worse. And the definitive study was published about 3 months ago in the Journal of American Medical Association in 2014, as you can see. Now, what they did is they got people who were living, and they scanned their hearts. And if you measure the amount of calcium in the arteries of the heart, the blood vessels perfusing the heart, you can measure what's called the calcium volume score. Turns out this is the best predictor of your heart attack risk. There's nothing better than this. And they wanted to show that. So what they did was they divided their groups of a couple of hundred people into 4 categories. These had the lowest scores, and those guys had the highest scores. And then they followed them from 20 years and found out, well, how many had heart attacks and other things that would indicate that the disease had become clinically apparent. So you have a heart attack. You could have disease without a heart attack, but now you have a heart attack, and that tells us you've got a clinical disease. So this group, they take the lowest group, and they find that's the risk is 1. We always start with 1. If you're in the next group, your risk has already doubled, which is a massive increase. And so although you're only in the low 50% of the group, you're still at risk. By the time you get into the 3rd quartile, the risk is 3-fold. And by the time you're in the 4th quartile, the risk is 5-fold. Now that is massive. If we measure your cholesterol and try to predict what your risk is, the value is 1.3. It's meaningless. This is if you believe that cholesterol causes heart disease and can predict future risk, you see it's a terribly poor predictor. Here you've got something that predicts 6-fold risk. So the message is if you want to know what your risk of heart disease is, go and have the scan done. Don't worry about your blood. You must measure this. Now the key is they also measured cholesterol. Now that must mean that the cholesterol must be lowest in this group and highest in that group, or the theory doesn't hold water. And I hope that you all see that. Because look here. These are the results. Sure, fantastic. They're normal. They're below. 200 is the units the Americans use. 200 is 5 units, as we would use. So thank goodness this group is absolutely as you'd predict. They have low cholesterol, no disease. Let's look at the second group. Oops. Those values are lower. Now this group is at 3-fold increased risk. What's it? Cholesterol's the same. And this group is at 6-fold risk. Cholesterol's the same. So this tells you that measuring your cholesterol has absolutely no value in telling you what your coronary arteries look like. And what your coronary arteries look like tell you what you're going to have a heart attack or not, whether you're at risk of heart attack. So you might as well throw out cholesterol as a measure. It's completely useless. Unfortunately, they didn't publish a plot where they had coronary artery scores and cholesterol concentrations, because it would have been all over the place. And why didn't they publish it? Because it would have destroyed the theory in the Journal of American Medical Association. And that would have been catastrophic for their careers. Yeah. Okay. So Brown and Goldstein said the more LDL there is in the blood, the more rapidly atherosclerosis develops. That is false. So please, would you hand back your Nobel Prize? So that's that. I'm not going to, in the interest of time, I'm not going to show you a video clip. No, in fact, no, I'm not going, because we haven't got the sound and so on. But a clogged artery is not a problem. It is absolutely not a problem, because a clogged artery cannot cause these. What has to happen is this plaque has to rupture. And the rupturing process is separate from what might have caused the cholesterol to accumulate there. And no one tells you that. So there is a secondary effect here, and we believe it's inflammation. That inflammation causes this plaque to rupture, that causes a blood clot, and then you get these things. So if you've got stable clogged arteries, they're no problem. They may cause you a bit of chest pain, that's true. And if you have it in legs, it may cause you some leg pain, but they're not going to cause this until they rupture. Now the problem is that the probability of rupture is independent of how much clogging there is. And you can have an artery which has minor disease and it can rupture. And you could have arteries like this which have got a lot of clogging which will not rupture. And the medical model is, if you come and we see that, we will put a stent down there and try to open it. And that has no effect on your risk of dying, none at all. Because the other arteries, which are small and mildly affected, are likely to rupture just as quickly as that one is. And you can't do all of them. And that is established. So this treating the clogged artery doesn't help. You have to keep the plaque stable. That's the key. Okay, so that model doesn't work. And so that one doesn't work either. So now I've gone through the 4 points, and none of them have been proven. Now I'll show you that we place all our dietary guidelines on this failed model, for which there is no evidence. Okay. Everything should be made as simple as possible, if not simpler. Well, the pharmaceutical industry decided, let's make it as simple as possible. We can all understand this: clogged arteries, heart disease, death. That's easy. Well, it's wrong. All these predictions remain unproven. And I've given you the core evidence. And so Rothberg wrote, although the image of coronary arteries as kitchen pipes clogged with fat is simple, familiar, and evocative, it is wrong. And I hope I've been able to convince you that it is wrong. Okay, so now I'm going to show you the really interesting stuff, which I really only discovered a few days ago. This is from 2 different papers, and this one shows the death rates from heart disease in Europe. This is heart disease. So it appears after the First World War, it reaches a peak in 1970, and it is disappearing. It is disappearing. And this is an epidemic for which the cause is unknown. We do not know the cause, because all the interventions that we've put in place occurred after 1970. We didn't know what to do before 1970. The statin drugs, for example, come along in 1980. They make no difference whatsoever to that. Although we pay $40 billion a year to flood people with statins, we're treating a disease that is disappearing. And we have no idea what caused it, what at all. Interestingly, the South African, if you look at the Xhosa and Zulu-speaking South Africans, they are starting to peak. They start to rise only in 1980. So they've got so the South African might be totally different. But in the Caucasian populations in Europe, that's it. And in North America, the disease is gone. It's history. And we never knew what caused it. Now let's look at the theory that it's because you eat red meat. Well, this is now I apologize, because now I've only got United States data, and I'm assuming that these data are pretty similar in the United States as in Europe. This is poultry consumption, and poultry consumption has actually increased as the diseases come down, so I don't think we can explain that with poultry as the cause. But let's look at meat, because the guidelines we're going to give you were designed on cutting meat from the diet. This was the meat intake in North America in 1800. This is what it is when the disease starts. It is much lower. It is substantially lower. So how come these people didn't have heart disease? because heart disease, the first cases are described in 1912. People have been eating more meat. And this is a lovely book, Horowitz, Putting Meat on the American Table. It shows you the Americans had so much meat in the early 1700s, 1800s, because it was just everywhere. They didn't grow grains because it was a waste of time. There was so much food in the form of meat. So meat, red meat has come down. Okay, it does rise as the disease is going up, but it's still much lower here than it was there, and the disease has disappeared. And so the total meat intake has gone up a little bit, but it's continued going up because of the poultry and the disease coming down. So if people say meat's causing the problem, it can't be, because we were quite healthy here when we were eating lots of meat. So that's a nice, interesting thing. And then this is the final slide on this to show you the decline. This is what they predicted in the United States. This is what they predicted in 2004, the disease would be gone by 2013. That means new cases. Of course, there are people who've got the disease and will continue, and there are lots of them. But as far as new cases going, that's in women. And this is the actual data. These are actual data that predict the disease will go away by 2017. Yeah. So that's the data. And we spend all our time worrying about a disease that's disappearing. And we put guidelines in place to prevent this disease, which we haven't a clue what caused, and then we cause other problems, as I'll show you. So what happens in 1977? These guys, these clever guys, the Senate committee get together and they say, we've got this heart disease epidemic, but remember, the disease is now going away. They kind of missed it by 7 years. And the disease is not going away. So what they do is irrelevant because it's not going to influence the outcome. And they say you must do this, that, and the other. You must reduce fat and so on. And these guidelines are drawn up by a vegan, Nick Moten, who had no training in nutritional sciences. But now we know, reducing consumption of fat, there's no proven benefit in it. There's no clinical trial. There have been 3 major trials of long-term studies of 8 to 10 years or longer of people eating low-fat diets. No benefit has ever been shown. None at all. Switch to vegetable fats. Vegetable oils increase heart cancer risk. So you wouldn't want to do that. Eggs are the most nutritious foods in the world. So why would you want to take eggs out of your diet? And eating grains is a problem because gluten in wheat is undigestible by humans. Gluten in wheat is undigestible by humans. And it causes a condition called the leaky gut in everyone who eats wheat. And that's a whole nother problem which we're not going to talk about today. So what happened was then these foods that we've been brought up on in the 1900s suddenly get relegated to the 3rd tier, and these foods get brought to the top tier. And the problem with those foods is all they are is just bags of glucose. So we take out the nutritious foods and we replace them with glucose. And what happens if we can't metabolize glucose all that well? Then we're going to get problems, as I'll show you. So what happens to the world? This is a study from America showing how the calorie consumption is 2,500 calories a day in 1971 in the men, a little bit lower in the women. This is how much comes from carbohydrate, that's how much from fat, and that's from saturated fat. And we're going to follow what happens by 2000. For the first 10 years, nothing happens because they've only been told to change their diets here. Then Americans are very clever, they do what they're told to do, so they eat more carbohydrates. Fantastic. Now they're going to become healthy. They're eating more carbohydrate. The men do it, the women do it, but there's unintended consequences which were known. They knew this would happen, but no one bothered. The calorie consumption went up, and the calorie consumption went up, and it stayed high. So guess what happens when you eat more? You get fat. And that's what happened. And this is called carbohydrate-induced hyperphagia. Carbohydrates drive hunger. They do not satiate. And that now is the European Food Authority has said you may not claim that carbohydrates satiate anymore because there's no evidence for it. Yeah. And last night they came out with another statement that you may not claim that carbohydrates are necessary for brain function. Yeah. They finally said it. They finally said it. Yeah. So those are 2 key. Whenever we debate things with nutritionists, they tell us those 2 arguments. They're both garbage. You do not need carbohydrates. There is no carbohydrate deficiency disease described in humans, none. There are plenty of protein deficiency and plenty of fat deficiency diseases. Carbohydrates are utterly unessential for life, completely unessential. You've got a liver, it'll produce all the carbohydrates you need. Okay, so this was predictable, absolutely predictable. So they get fatter, they eat more carbohydrates and they get fatter. This is the proportion of men who are obese, and you'll see it starts to rise when? In 1980. The obesity epidemic begins in 1980, not in 1970, not in 1960, 1980, in both men and women, and it continues unabated and is uncontrollable. It is completely uncontrollable unless we do something serious about the nutrition. And then this shows at all ages. If it doesn't matter, 18 to 29, oops, up it goes, 65 or over, 30 to 40, or 45 to 64. It matters not what age you were. But after 1980, you start to get fatter. And this gets worse with each generation. We know that each generation is now fatter. And then what happens is diabetes comes along. And here the rates of diabetes increase dramatically. Obesity increases, children obesity increases. And guess what? No one will take responsibility for this. No one. What do they say is, it's your fault for getting fat. It's not, we've got nothing to do with it. You're lazy and gluttonous, and that's what caused it. So what happened was it took us millions of years to get to this perfect state, and this guy is perfectly right. We all should look like that because he's got a regulator in the brain that is making sure he eats just enough calories to match how much calories he's expending. And then in 28 years, that's what we produce. And this guy is fat because his brain controls are gone haywire. And he's now eating too many calories, and that's the key. It's the calorie consumption that drives obesity. It is not lack of exercise, because this guy's homeostatically regulated, means everything's in balance. So he's eating this amount of calories and he's expending that amount of energy. If he cuts the energy expenditure, today he doesn't run 10 Ks, guess what happens? He eats less and he maintains his weight. Tomorrow he runs 20 Ks, he eats more. That's how a regulated system works. So lack of exercise cannot be the cause of obesity. It absolutely cannot. You have to break the regulator. And the regulator is under the control of addictive foods, and that's where it's all gone wrong. It's the introduction of addictive foods that's the problem. Now let me tell you what the real problem is, and this is this condition of insulin resistance. And that's what we all have to understand because it's not taught. And the whole basis of everything I've ever said is that this diet is for people with insulin resistance. Okay. And if you have insulin resistance, you may not eat carbohydrate. That's the key. That's the basic message, which doesn't get out in our medical training. But I think the general public are understanding it much better now. So what happens is there are a couple of diseases that appear above the surface. So you go to the doctor, and he checks what he can see. You've got high blood pressure, you've got gout, you've got diabetes. What he fails to understand is what's hidden, and this is insulin resistance. So if you have type 2 diabetes, gout, obesity, hypertension, or this, what we call atherogenic dyslipidemia, this is the real bad cholesterol. But it's a combination of factors which we'll go through slowly. They are all the same disease. They are not different diseases. They're all one disease. And some people will present with gout, some with obesity, some with hypertension, some with this, and some with that. But they're all the same disease and the same treatment. But we don't do that. We treat them all the same way, ineffectively, because we don't understand what's lying below the surface. And that is insulin resistance. And all of us are born, in my view, somewhere along this curve. We're either highly tolerant or we're highly intolerant. Or we're in the middle, but we're somewhere along this curve. And if you're carbohydrate tolerant, you do not need to listen to this lecture. You may eat what you like. You can ignore everything I've ever said, okay? Because you're insulin sensitive, and that's generally athletes, and normally these people will keep normal body weight for life. But normal body weight does not mean you're not insulin resistant. That's an important point to make. Okay, because I'm classically here. I'm highly intolerant, as I'll show you. So, but if you're intolerant, these are the markers, the clinical markers that we can see. Your waistline expands, you become obese, you develop a metabolic syndrome, which is a combination of all these things, and you get type 2 diabetes. And this is the inevitable outcome. Inevitable outcome if you're profoundly carbohydrate intolerant and you eat carbohydrates from birth. And that is what we tell people to do. We tell them to eat carbohydrates from birth, and we don't make a distinction that that's fine if you're at this end of the curve, but it's not very good if you're at that end of the curve. So that's the problem. So now, what is insulin resistance? Very briefly, it is, in my view, a genetic disorder with which you are born. Okay, that's important, because that's not what we teach. We teach you get lazy, you put on weight, you become insulin resistant. You lose weight, insulin resistant reverses. That's garbage. I'm as insulin resistant today as I was when I was much heavier. My insulin resistance hasn't changed one iota because it's genetic. It's built in. And in time, we will detect that early in childhood, and we're able to say who's most insulin resistant. So in my view, it's a genetic predisposition that just gets worse with age because we eat lots of carbohydrate, lots of fructose, and we become inactive, physically inactive. And the key abnormality is your liver overproduces glucose. And it overproduces glucose for a very simple reason, that insulin inhibits glucose production in the liver. But insulin doesn't act properly. It's like the key doesn't fit the lock properly. That's insulin resistance. The key, which is insulin, is for some reason doesn't fit in the lock. The lock's abnormal. And then, so you can secrete all the insulin you like, it doesn't correct the problem. That's why the problem is stuck forever, because the receptor is wrong in some way. So that's insulin resistance. And so your body pours out glucose, and then your glucose is up unless you can store it. But if you can store it, you're fine. But with insulin resistance, you can't. You can't store all the extra glucose that is being produced. And you can't use it as a fuel either. So it has to go somewhere else. And firstly, it rises in the bloodstream. So you get increased blood glucose, and then your insulin has to increase. And then what happens, because insulin now acts on the liver, and that causes huge problems because some of the parts of the liver, it does work. It doesn't work for glucose, but it works for fat. And what you convert that carbohydrate into fat in the liver, so you get a fatty liver, and then that is and then it forms triglycerides, which are stored in the fat tissues. And then finally, you reduce your good HDL cholesterol. Remember, that was an important point. And you increase production of these small, dense LDL, the bad particles. And so here, this is how you get atherogenic dyslipidemia. And it's all explicable on the basis of insulin resistance with a high carbohydrate diet. So that's the insulin model of heart disease, which is the opposite to the cholesterol model, because in this model, you mustn't eat carbohydrates. You must eat fat to prevent you from dying of heart disease. So then the question is, well, which one's right? And, well, I don't know, but I tend to favor this one. Because my view is this makes absolute sense. The evidence is all there. I can show you hundreds of papers proving all of these points, but I can't show you one paper proving the cholesterol theory. Okay, so this is the model. This is the model, and it's developed by Gerald Raven, who's a genius. He should get the Nobel Prize, but won't. And he won't get it because he did studies in the 1980s showing if you took diabetics and you put them on a low-carbohydrate diet, they got incredibly better. But he lost his nerve. He lost his nerve. Because I think that he would have been demonized if he'd said in Stanford, the core of, at Stanford University, and the cardiologists there don't believe him, and they're promoting a low-fat diet, and he comes along and says you must eat a high-fat diet, he's going to get demonized. He's going to get thrown out of the faculty. So he daren't take the final step and say the treatment for insulin resistance is a low-carbohydrate diet. And he vacillates, and he says, well, it's a moderately reduction in carbohydrate. And then he justifies it by saying humans won't adapt to a low-carbohydrate diet. They won't accept it. And that's how he lets himself off. And that's why he won't get the Nobel Prize, because he describes this condition. And he could provide a cure, but he doesn't, which is tragic. So his model is insulin resistance causes oversecretion of insulin, or continuous oversecretion of insulin. And it's that which causes all the conditions of syndrome X. For example, high blood pressure is caused by hyperinsulinemia acting on the sympathetic nervous system, driving your blood pressure up. It's got nothing to do with salt. It's got everything to do with insulin. And then you go through syndrome X, which is what I've shown you get heart disease. Or else you go this way, and your pancreas fails, and you don't produce enough insulin, you get type 2 diabetes, and you go to coronary heart disease. Now remember, we've said this disease is going away, but this disease is becoming more prevalent. And this is the disease that you've got to worry about. This is irrelevant disease. It's absolutely irrelevant. Now if you have a heart attack, it's a minor inconvenience, honestly. You might die, okay? But I've been working with heart patients for 30 years, and some of them are still alive. And they had a heart attack in the 1970s, and we thought they were going to be dead in 5 weeks, and they're not. They're still alive. This is the disease that you have to worry about, because what does it do? It gives you stroke, dementia, which are really difficult to manage. You lose your eyesight, you become blind. You lose your kidney function, you have to go into dialysis, and you lose your legs. And that's the disease. It doesn't kill you, but you become disabled for years. And that's the one we have to worry about. If some of those people get heart disease, okay, that's a problem. But we've got to stop. And the point is, it's completely preventable. Not one person has to have diabetes. Because if we detected you've got insulin resistance and you're eating a high carbohydrate diet, we can detect you're on the way to diabetes and stop it by just cutting the carbs. Simple as that. So we can completely prevent this disease. And yet we kind of haven't got that worked out yet. Why? Because we tell people it's fat in the diet that's killing you. You take too much fat, you do all this goes wrong, and you get arterial clogging, and all these diseases are just separate, distinct diseases, and they aren't. And why is this wrong? Because triglycerides and HDL are directed by the carbohydrates in the diet, not the fat. So that is completely wrong. So the model doesn't work, as I've shown you. This is the model that works. It's the high carbohydrate diet that causes all these abnormalities. All these abnormalities. And we can detect them all in people on a high carbohydrate diet who are insulin resistant. And then you eat too little fish and too little omega-3s and too much vegetable oils, and you get these diseases. And that's the metabolic syndrome and everything. And they're all one disease. They're one disease. And all you do, you've got to get the insulin down. That's the key. You have to get insulin down. And you do that by cutting that. And you cure these diseases. Or at least you put them in remission. And we've got people who are cured of diabetes, and one of them sitting there, Brian Berkman, who cured himself of diabetes by going on this diet. And he probably would like to chat to you later, but he cut his insulin, and he's not cured of diabetes. If he goes back on his diet and eats a high carbohydrate diet, his diabetes will appear, but it's in remission. And he's a healthy man now, from 150 kilograms to 78, 81. Yeah. And he's the person who proves the model works. Of course he's an anecdote, but he proves it because he had all these diseases, or most of them, and he cured all of them by just doing that. Yeah. Okay. Now, this is the crucial point for the media to understand this. So why have we got so many fat people in South Africa? Okay? Is it because they're eating fat? Here are the guidelines drawn up by this expert who teaches and directs most of nutrition in South Africa. And what does she say? Sorry, these are South African guidelines. These are the South African guidelines for eating. 2013, absolutely up to date. And I don't criticize her because that's what she believes and that's what she's taught. But I think we can explain things rather easily if we look at these guidelines. Make starchy foods the base of most meals. Eat plenty of vegetables, which is fantastic, but not fruit. Fruit's a problem because it's got too much carbohydrate in it. Eat fat sparingly, I restrict fats. And now, what I've shown you, this is the perfect prescription for obesity. You could not have a better prescription for obesity in insulin resistance. In any insulin resistant population, this is the perfect prescription for obesity and type 2 diabetes. And the evidence is absolutely there. It's all in the literature. But you've got to connect the dots. And if you don't connect the dots, you're in trouble. Does it work? Well, a group of South African scientists, really good nutritionists, go out to the Vaal, and they look at this low-income women who are not healthy, they are sick. And what do you think they're eating? The theory must be they're eating lots of fat. They must be eating a 70% fat diet that Dr. Noakes is telling you to eat, and it's going to kill you. Okay. Which is the diet I'm eating. What are they eating? They're eating the prudent, healthy, perfect diet. They're eating 20% fat, 70% carbohydrate. That is the ideal diet, according to our guidelines. And what do they have? They have high rates of obesity, hypertension, and dyslipidemia. Which form of dyslipidemia? High triglycerides and low HDL. What is that? That's insulin resistance. That's what it is. And they will also have high rates of diabetes, but they weren't screened in this experiment. And they have hypertension. Hypertension is part of the metabolic syndrome and insulin resistance. This population is insulin resistant. Their high carbohydrate diet is contraindicated. And does this apply to all obese rural South African females? Of course it does. We tell them to eat a high carbohydrate diet, a maize-based diet, and then we wonder why they get fat when they're insulin resistant. I must make the point that insulin resistance by itself is perfectly benign, I think. It's completely benign. It has to be. Otherwise, it wouldn't be so prevalent. It must have had survival value, and that's why it's been sustained in the evolution. But when you eat carbohydrates, it's a real problem. So I think you can have insulin resistance and have an absolutely perfect life if you eat low carbohydrates. Okay, so let's finally sum up So what causes obesity? This is the model, the energy imbalance model. This is the one we teach at our medical schools. You just eat too much of anything, you don't expend enough, and you get fat. And that's garbage. It's idiot. It's an idiotic explanation because it doesn't include the brain. It doesn't include the brain. And the brain is where the problem lies. In obesity, the brain is the cause of the problem because it's not working properly. It's not regulating your energy intake and your energy expenditure. And this model doesn't work because we tell people to burn more energy and eat less, and guess what happens? They get hungry, and so they eat more, and that's all that happens. So exercise will never, ever, ever change the problem. It will never reverse obesity because the brain, you have to control the regulator in the brain. And that is strongly influenced by what you're eating, your choice of fuel. That's crucial. And where Dr. Atkins got it right was because he said when you cut out the carbohydrates, you lose your hunger. You lose this addictive hunger. And that's the key to why this diet works so effectively in 90% of people, or in most people, because it cuts your hunger, and that is the key effect. If your diet does not cut your hunger, it will never work. And that's why this is not a diet, it's a lifestyle, because it changes your attitude to food. So I was sugar addicted. I was a binge eater. I binged on bread, and bread particularly, bread and sugar. I was a binge eater. And now I reversed it within a week by just going on this diet. As soon as I started eating protein and fat, binging went away, desire for sugar went away. So the sugar took 14 months, I'll take that right. But the binging just disappeared. And I recreated my brain. I fixed up my brain, and then I was fine. And so you have to understand, it's a brain disease we're dealing with. And that brain is influenced by what you're eating here. And you have to find out what you can eat and in what combination to take away your hunger, and then you'll be the proper weight. Okay, so then the other model, this is the hormonal model, and it's the insulin model, and here's insulin again. And in this case, it's carbohydrates that are the problem, because carbohydrates cause your blood glucose to rise, and when they rise, the insulin must be secreted by the pancreas to get the glucose down, because glucose is highly toxic to the body. The insulin unfortunately promotes fat cells to accumulate fat. So if you're going through this pathway, lots of carbohydrates in, lots of insulin, all the fat goes into the fat cells and it gets stuck there and it cannot come out. And only if you reduce your carbohydrate intake, lower the insulin, will you ever access that fat. Otherwise it's stuck there. And that's the key to this approach. And then carbohydrates drive hunger. So that's the complication. So insulin again is the problem. It's storing fat. And we know that. This is the textbook in medicine that I grew up with, Guyton. And what did Guyton say? Here's Guyton, this textbook. This is what all medical students are taught, but they're not taught its consequences. Insulin secretion is associated with energy abundance. That is, when there's great abundance of energy-giving foods in the diet, especially excess amounts of carbohydrate, insulin is secreted in great quantity. In turn, plays an important role in storing the excess energy. So there it's described, and his textbook is in the 11th edition. So he was saying this since the 1970s. This is textbook physiology, but we don't teach it. So if you want to get rid of that fat, you've got to get the insulin down by reducing carbohydrates. So what I've learned from reading on the internet, and this is the final slide, that your body mass index, and remember this diet's not just about body mass index, but that's the issue we're facing with obesity and diabetes. There are many other benefits to the diet which we're not going to go into today. But this suggests that it's a simplification. It's not the final answer, but it's a work in progress, and I've not done any science to prove it. But what it suggests is that the grams of carbohydrate in your diet and your level of insulin resistance determines what your body mass index. It's not calories. It's not calories. It's grams of carbohydrate. Because, in my view, the more carbohydrates you're eating, the more calories you'll be eating. So I understand that you can't get fat without eating calories, but they're not the calories that are driving the problem, it's the carbohydrates. So if you're mildly insulin resistant, like a Kenyan marathon runner, you'll be lean. This is very lean, regardless of how much carbohydrate you eat. And even if you cut your carbohydrates, you'll be fine. But if you're moderately insulin resistant, which is probably a good proportion of the population, the less carbohydrate, the thinner you'll be, because you will be eating less calories because you're not hungry. But now what happens, as you become more insulin resistant, If you cut your carbohydrate a little bit, it's going to make absolutely no difference. So reducing your carbohydrates by 100 grams, you're still fat. You have to get down below the turn point. You've got to get in here, this area here. And the more insulin resistant you are, the more you have to cut your carbs. So this guy will think, gee, I'm only eating 250 grams of carbohydrate. That's 5 apples a day. Surely I should lose weight. And he doesn't, because he's still above the turn point. He's got to get down here. And then if you're morbidly obese, and what are the morbidly obese told? They are told to eat fruit because fruit's so healthy for you. But 1 apple and 1 banana takes you to here, from there to there. It'll take you 50 grams. So that'll take this person from there. Here, we're trying to get them to 50 grams or 25 grams, and they're told to eat a banana and an apple. That's where their weight will be. They'll still be grossly overweight in their own view. And that's what we kind of believe now, is that the more insulin resistant you are, the more you have to cut your carbohydrates to be an ideal weight. And that's one of the key drivers of the nutritional advice, is that it's the grams of carbohydrate you eat and your level of insulin resistance. So the high carbohydrate diet I put you on 20 years ago, Dr. Noakes put you on 20 years ago, gave you diabetes, high blood pressure, and heart disease. Whoops. So, and when it's a joke, you realize it's true. And in the final slide, Daniel Boorstin said, I've observed that the world has suffered far less from ignorance than from pretensions to knowledge. And my contention is we pretend to know all about nutrition, and we actually got it all wrong. And I hope that you kind of got the message, and that it is a powerful message. And that we either choose to change or not. If we don't change, obesity and diabetes rates are going to go through the roof, and we will not save this nation, because the costs of treating these conditions will destroy all our medical care. And we have a choice. We either change or we continue. Thank you very much for your attention.